Hey, good morning, guys. It's been quite a few months since I've had an opportunity to make a video for you. Been really kind of busy on my personal projects and day job and COVID and everything else going on, but I felt the need to put this one together this morning. So what I've got pulled up is a post I saw this morning. I check Facebook every morning, just car stuff. That's just what I do. And this discussion was around a car that this guy picked up, Chase, and he's having a lot of trouble getting it to idle, and in particular when the fans kick on, or even worse when the AC's turned on. And as he says here, he's in Alabama, and it's not an option. He's got to have his AC working. So it's a new combo. He doesn't have any experience with tuning cars, and so he's looking for some advice on, is there something he can do? And because it's a new car, he wants to make sure it's mechanically sound too. And I get all that; totally makes sense. But when I looked through some of through some of the advice that he was being given from some people, I already know it's just not going to work. Ultimately, this car is very, very unlikely to ever drive well without a tune. And there's a couple reasons for that. So what I'm going to do today is show you in the tune specifically why this is not a good idea. So the first thing I want to look at is the base idle reset procedure, because this is where a lot of guys are going first. So just pulled up this doc. This has been around a long time, but this is basically Ford's documentation for doing what they call a base idle reset. And the idea here is that you can go through a process where you get the idle air control valve out of the way. So you're trying to get the engine to run on its own when you're not leaning on the idle air valve to let some extra air into the motor. And then you start messing with the throttle stop screw to open or close that a certain amount so you can get the car to idle without stalling. You go through a few other things. You set your throttle position, sensor's voltage, trying to get it to that glorious 0.98 volts, which I've already shown you in other videos, kind of a bunch of crap anyways for most of you. And then you kind of end up with this process, and it should idle better. They even talk about pulling the battery cable. And the reason they have you do that as part of the instructions is that just like your fuel trims, your computer's also storing memory related to the idle air valve, and a lot of guys don't know that. So the idle air valve also, it's kind of pre-programmed in the computer to open and close a certain amount and to do certain things, but it also learns a trim on that so that if it just recognizes your car consistently needs more or less idle air than what the factory thought you were going to need, it'll adjust slightly. But anyways, this is the base idle procedure, but this is not going to work on a combo like his. So going back here, if you look at some of the specs, and there's one thing in particular that stands out, a Trick Flow Stage 3 cam. That is a massive, massive cam, at least comparing it to a stock cam that came in the cars that it's expecting. It's a 93 GT. I'm going to guess it's probably an A9L computer, but I don't know a whole lot about the combo, but that's what I'm going to work through today. Now, one last thing before we go into the tune is I want to show you the cam specs between a stock cam and a Trick Flow Stage 3 and why this cam is going to idle so much differently. So in EEC Analyzer, one of the cool things they have here is they've got a lot of cam specs that kind of you can look at in this visualizer, and this cam profile grid over on the bottom right is a pretty cool piece of that. So right now what I've got loaded up is a stock cam from like an 89 to 90. I guess his was a 91 to 94, so we'll go to that. And here's what it's a low lift. It's a 0.444 inch lift both sides. And the duration is extremely low. And if you look over here, this is actually showing you, if you think about in terms of the crank rotation, it's starting to show you at what point the exhaust and intake sides are opening up, both at 0.050 lift and 0.006 lift, depending on how you want to look at that duration. But this overlap right here, this period, this is really the key part of idle control. Where as you change to different cam profiles and this overlap is different and the duration is substantially different, that's where you start to run into problems. So you notice here that you've got 39 and 0 as your overlap numbers. This is the number of degrees where there's overlap at these certain points. Now let me load up the Trick Flow Stage 3 and watch when the screen refreshes when I click on that. Look how much different this is. This is going way further over here. The exhaust is going way more over here, and you have a ton of overlap. And the duration is massive compared to the other. You had 444 lift, you're up to 574, 595, and your duration at 50 was like, well under 220 from the factory. And here you go. So this is a really lumpy cam. Okay. So with that being said, what do we have to do to make it idle well? Well, the first thing is just that you got to remember these factory computers, assuming they had that stock cam, they had a really low idle RPM. So I'm going to jump into binary editor and we're going to start there. So this is a base A9L configuration with no changes. And under this idle category, we start here. That's your factory desired idle once the car's warmed up and you're past the startup period. 672 RPMs. There is 0% chance you're going to get that car with a trick flow stage 3 to idle at 672 RPMs no matter what you do. It's just not going to work. So the first thing you'd logically do is go in here and you would increase this. How much you need to increase it, every car is different, every cam's different, but 672 is not going to cut it. I can just tell you right now. If I had to guess, you're probably going to want that thing to sit somewhere around 8 to 900, but probably around 824, 850. Is where I would try to target and see if I could get it going there. But there is a desired idle, and this is that. Now, why this is important is there's a couple things in particular the computer's doing to try to maintain idle in an attempt to get to this at all times. Spark and idle air control. So what we're going to do now is look at those two things in the tune, and you're going to see why if you just open that throttle stop screw and try to get a bunch of air in the car, it's just still not going to work. So next thing we're going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk through a few of these other settings in here. So when we jump down into the idle air control, this is the first thing I want to bring to your attention. So this is an adder versus RPM. So think about it. If the stock computer was trying to idle at 672, then you would argue that 600 RPMs is you're already starting to stall. It's coming down pretty far. By 450, you're definitely about to stall out. 350, it's almost guaranteed. So you notice that under normal conditions, it's not trying to add any additional idle air in here. But as the RPMs drop, it starts to force that idle air valve up. And this is just kind of an offset. It's just going to increase it by this much no matter what else is going on. And that's a pretty substantial amount of airflow as far as that's concerned. If you look at the ISC transfer function, so this is rated in pounds per minute. This is your idle air valve, and this is its duty cycle. So if that thing is pegged wide open and it's letting as much extra air into the engine as it possibly can without you touching the pedal, it can put in 2.35 pounds per minute. So notice at the bottom end of that chart where it said it was opening 0.5 pounds per minute, you're already at 50% duty cycle to get there. So that valve is opening way up to try to keep the car from stalling. But again, to go back to that area, that's really not kicking in until the RPMs are really, really low. So as an exercise, let's say we wanted to, I'm just going to make the numbers easy. Let's say we're going to raise your idle by 200 RPM. So instead of 672, it's going to be at 872 now. Cool. The next thing you would want to do generally as a starting point is take these same RPMs and add the same amount. So now this extra amount of air isn't waiting till 450 RPMs to kick in. It's going to start kicking in at 650, and you bring it all up accordingly. Now again, this will probably need some more fine tuning, but this at least gives you a starting point. If you still have stalling, another thing you can do is take this number right here and try raising it up a little bit higher. So maybe you come up to 675, which essentially makes this extra air kick in a little quicker. 680, 690. You have to tune this stuff, but that's generally the first thing that you would have to do if you want to increase your target idle. You need to bring this up too. Otherwise, even though it's trying to target it, if you start to stall out, it's not going to catch itself until it dips way, way down. And another interesting thing there, going back to this article, he talks about when he kicks all this stuff on, the surge usually goes down to this range of about 600. That's interesting. Think about that, because that's the point when this idle air valve started to kick in extra. As soon as it got below 600, it started blending towards this increased airflow. It's not rocket science. This is in the tune, and it's there for a reason. So that's probably why it started to catch itself, and you noticed it around 600. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing that you'll want to really take a look at there. Now, the next thing is we want to talk about, well, how much air does the engine need to idle? And that's controlled right here. So again, with the computer targeting 672 from the factory, you notice they have an exact entry at 672, and they say this engine needs this amount of air. So this is, how much idle air it believes your engine combination needs to maintain idle. And so in a good tune, what I would normally do is if I'm going to target, 872 or whatever the number is, doesn't matter. You're ultimately going to need to figure out, well, how much air does it need? And there's a procedure to go through. I'm not going to get into that today. But ultimately, you'd want to have a number here that's right out wherever your target idle is, so that you know you've got something really, really stable there. Otherwise, if you go back to a factory setup, it's just kind of blending between those all the time. And it's kind of always in a state of fluctuation where you don't have something where it's just really, really dialed in right at that point. So just another kind of thing to consider. But this works in combination with this guy right here. And so if we now know how much idle air this car needs to maintain an idle, and you plug that into the neutral idle air we were just looking at, now it's time to figure out, well, what's the calculation of how far to open the idle air valve to maintain that. So if we know that we need a total amount of air, well, the next question is how much is getting through the throttle body already? And that's what this guy right here is. And this is telling you that there's already, with a stock setup, so think about this, stock throttle body, stock engine, stock everything, set exactly the way the factory set it. They had a procedure for opening that throttle stop screw, a very specific amount, the 0.98 volt thing, that's where that came from. These are factory specs. And under that condition, that's how much air was coming through the throttle blade. So then the computer knows if I'm trying to have this much air and I know this much is getting through the throttle body, here's how much that I expect that idle air valve to have to throw in as well. And then it starts to adjust. You throw a bigger throttle body on it, you have a different engine combo, your idle air needs are different, how much air is coming through the throttle body is going to be totally different. If you just arbitrarily set your stuff at 0.98 volts, that doesn't mean anything if you don't have a factory engine and throttle body, because setting it there is ultimately going to have a massive impact on this, especially as you go to the bigger throttle bodies. You put it at these higher voltages, you're letting a lot more air through. So all this stuff plays together, but this is going to have some major issues if you go down that path. So that's really a big part of it. And then lastly, I wanted to show you this gain. So the idle air gain is saying, this is basically, you have to think about it as how quick is it adjusting. So when it goes over speed and it knows it needs to wean some of that air back off to try to get the RPMs back down, or when it goes under speed and it tries to add some more air back in to pep it up, this is kind of, you could think of as how quick it's trying to kick that air in or pull it out. So you notice, again, factory was 672 RPMs, which is right in the middle of these two cells right here, and it's at a gain of 1.0. So it's basically just behaving like normal. It's not freaking out. It's not overreacting to anything. It's just a very steady, stable setup. But when it starts to go under speed, you notice that it goes into kind of a panic mode, and it ramps up very quickly as we drop from 650 to about 500 RPMs. And so it can react quicker to lift that air up. Well, same thing, if you think about it, if you just crank up that throttle stop screw till the car idles at, 800 or 850 or 900 without a tune, well, first of all, this is way into stall territory before it ever starts to react quicker if you are still trying to get some idle air out of that thing. And up top, this is constantly in a state of overreacting too. So if you're now trying to get it to idle here on purpose but doing it without a tune, this idle air valve is just going to be constantly fluttering around and doing weird stuff. Granted, it'll probably be not open much at all, but even when it is, it's just going to be fluttering around. It's not a good way to do it. So same thing, just as a starting point, bring that stuff up by the same number of RPMs as your target idle, and then fine tune from there. But now that you know your target idle is in a range where it's not going to be in a steady state of rapid fluctuation with excessive gain here. So that's pretty important. So that's really the idle air side of things. There's a few other things to talk about, but that's the main part that has to do with idle. So just kind of wanted to show you that. There's also in your tune, there's a setting right here around airflow. And so what this is talking about is when you kick your AC on, there's extra load on the motor. It's going to need a little bit of extra idle air to come through to sort of combat that and keep your idle from dipping. So what this is basically saying is that this is the extra amount of air coming through your engine. When the AC comes on, it'll open up that idle air valve a little extra, and then it reduces it back by this much when you turn the AC back off. So this is another one of those things that sometimes you might need to tinker with this a little bit, especially when you've got electric fans, because the stock clutch fan, when the AC kicked on, the fan's just kind of generally doing what it's doing anyways. But with an electric fan that sometimes is kicking on at the same time as your AC because they're kind of wired together, not only do you have the extra load of the AC clutch, being engaged and, putting that drag on the motor, but now your fans are kicking on, so everything's stressed a little bit extra. So sometimes you have to mess with these numbers, but, just something to keep in mind. And also, when your AC's on, the factory asks the engine to maintain a slightly higher RPM. You can adjust this too. So, if you're having a lot of issues, sometimes, I've had to do this where you'll raise this up just a little bit extra, another 30 or 40 RPMs total. And between that and messing with this airflow, you find the right balance there. That can really help out when you kick your AC on. Okay, so that's most of what I wanted to talk about there. Now, the other side of this is your spark. So same thing, remember, if we're targeting a specific RPM, then the closed loop spark control is going to constantly add or remove spark to try to maintain that state. And so what you have is this multiplier. So where this starts out actually is here. So the car from the factory starts with this concept of a 31 degree possible timing at idle. And then what it does is there's a multiplier that hits against that based on when you're under or over speed. So if you're at this 0, that means that if you're targeting X RPMs, you are actually at X RPMs. So this is how much spark you would get, 0.648. So if we open a calculator and we do 31 degrees times 0.648, you'd actually be idling at about 20 degrees. And this assumes that when you set your base timing on your distributor, you set it at 10 degrees. Everything in the tune always assumes 10 was your base. So with all that stuff being stock, you'd end up with about 20 degrees when everything's perfect. And then you notice here that the number's lower. So this negative 60 means when it's actually kind of the opposite of what you would think, this delta. But if your car is 60 RPMs too high and it needs to come down 60 to get back to that desired, then it would only have this much spark. So running that, we run the same 31 times 0.484, now it would be down to 15 degrees. So that's kind of your bottom threshold for that idle timing. So when the car's really over speed, higher than target, it's going to pull back the timing to 15 degrees. And then when it starts to stall out and it's down to 110 RPMs less than your desired, then it's going to ramp the spark way back up. So now it's going to be 31 times 0.969, and it'll jump up to 30 degrees. So you basically have this window of 15 to 30 degrees timing, with 20 kind of being where it stays if everything's good, but it'll jack it way up to 30 if it starts to stall. But this is all in relation to your target. So again, think about that. Factory 672, so if you just go in there and jack your throttle body way up so it idles at 900 or something, but the tune doesn't know you've done any of that, it always thinks you're running over speed. And this is probably in that case more important than the idle air stuff, because if you're forcing the air into the engine, you don't necessarily have to worry as much about that idle air valve acting weird, because you ultimately always have air coming into the engine. It'll probably be okay. But from a spark standpoint, you're going to be living here 100% of the time, down here like 100% of the time. So your spark is going to be really, really low. And when you have low spark with a more efficient cylinder head and all this other stuff, you might actually have needed a little bit more spark anyways with the combo. That's entirely possible. But even if you didn't, you're still going to end up with 5 degrees less timing at idle than you would if you had tuned this properly. So that's something I would always do. I would go in here, I would get my target set up where I want it, and then I would think about, do I want to make any fine-tune adjustments here? And sometimes what you can do is you can try to move this RPM out a little bit so that it doesn't react for an overspeed condition quite as quick where it starts to pull spark, because when you get caught in that swing, you're just getting caught between these two areas a lot of times. So you can kind of tame this down by lowering that number some more, and then really you can focus more on the downside when it starts to come down and stall out. Maybe you can have some of that come in a little quicker. Now, you also do have to be careful about that though, because with a lumpy cam, it's not going to have a rock solid idle that's going to be equivalent to what a stock computer did. I mean, that thing is a small cam, and it's just really, really, it's really, really stable. So when you have something that naturally fluctuates a little bit more anyways, you don't want the computer to get into a mode where it's constantly freaking out to that sort of natural characteristic of the cam. So sometimes you have to widen these RPM deltas so that it's not going into freak out mode. So, really, that's the basic part of what I wanted to talk about, Chase. I hope this helps you understand, where I'm coming from when I say a base idle reset's not a good idea for a stock, for a modified car like yours with such a large cam. The characteristics of that cam, you're never going to idle well a 672. You can band-aid it, and you can jack your throttle stop way open and hope that you don't set a code for the throttle position sensor being at too high at voltages. But there's a right way and a wrong way, and I agree. Back in the day, we didn't have all these tuning options, and a lot of this knowledge wasn't really readily available out there in the public domain. So sure, I get it. You did what you had to do, but these quarter horse chips, binary editor software, the strategies from Core Tuning, and a million other tuning options out there. I mean, this stuff has been around for quite a few years now, and this is the right way to do it. So I'd encourage you to hit me up if you're interested in having me help you out and get your stuff tuned right. I know we can make a big difference for you quickly. So guys, that's it for today. If you need any help with your tune, any questions, comments, want me to look at any data logs you have, or if you're just looking for some guidance in general, hit me up anytime. I'm on Facebook. Look up Leach Tuning at the Leach 405. Or you can also email me anytime, matt@leachtuning.com. Thanks, guys. Good luck. Godspeed.